Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming along to this event, an introduction to the OFS for all higher education staff members. I'm Molly Lawson, the Stakeholder Engagement Advisor here at the OFS, and I'm going to host this session today. Next slide, please. Before we start, I'd like to go over some housekeeping. First, please note that closed captions are available, and you can access these by using the CC icon on your screen. Your presenters today are Josh Fleming, our Director of Strategy and Delivery, and Philippa Pickford, our Director of Regulation. This event is being recorded and will be available on the event webpage afterwards. And I'd like to invite you to ask any questions you might have. You can use the Q&A function to do this. Philippa and Josh will be answering your questions later in the session. We'll have a lot of people attending today, so we'll try and get through as many questions as possible, but we'll also be signposting you to the right place to ask your questions if they don't get answered today, or if your question is specific to your institution. If you have any questions for the events team, for example, if you're having any technical issues, please do use the chat box. Next slide, please. Today, we'll be introducing our work, including our history, what regulation looks like in practice, and our approach moving forward. As I said, we'll also be answering some questions towards the end of this session. For now, I'll pass on to Josh Fleming, our Director of Strategy and Delivery. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Molly, and hello, everyone. It's fantastic to have so many of you joining the call today. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Josh Fleming. I'm the Director of Strategy and Delivery, as Molly said, here at the Office for Students. And I'm responsible for strategy, evaluation, stakeholder engagement, and communications. I'm also getting over a cold at the moment, so apologies if my voice is a little bit hoarse today. So this is an opportunity for you to learn and understand more about what we do, who we are, and to make it as useful as possible, we're going to save as much time as we can for questions. So as I'm going through, as Molly said, please do use the Q&A function. Please do drop your questions in. Don't be shy. There are no silly questions. And if you're wondering about something, it's almost certain that someone else has got the same question in their mind as well. So I'm going to kick off with a brief overview about who we are and why we were set up. And I'm going to talk about what we're doing now as well, 6 years into our existence. Next slide, please. So the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017, or HERA as it's known, established the OFS, and we've been regulating the higher education sector since 2018. We're an independent public body. We're not part of central government, but we do report to Parliament through the Department for Education. HERA does make provision for the government to influence the OFS's work in various ways through publishing statutory guidance or giving general directions. An example of this would be the annual guidance letter that we receive on the distribution of our funding. So we have regard to this guidance when we're making decisions, but the decisions themselves are taken independently. Perhaps it's worth me spending a bit of time here to talk about why we regulate and why the OFS was set up in the first place. So there were and are lots of reasons for introducing a regulator. I'm going to focus on 3 here. So number 1, the system got a lot bigger over the last 30 years. The number of students has roughly doubled in that time, and the proportion of young adults who go into higher education is somewhere around 50% now. So you've got a bigger system with more individual interests at stake and more taxpayer money flowing in, hence the introduction of a regulator to protect those interests. Reason 2, students themselves are bearing more of the costs of higher education. So in 2012, as many or most of you will know, tuition fees rose and there was a shift away from teaching funded by direct grant from government towards student loans. And that continued a trend from the decade prior as well. So the case for a regulator to protect these students who are making a huge investment, both in terms of time and money, grew even more compelling with this shift. And reason 3, there was a desire among some to correct for perceived imbalances between teaching and research. So the policy landscape prior to the OFS and the incentives for the sector perhaps skewed a little towards the latter, towards research. So one reason for introducing a regulator was to redress this balance so that the policy environment promotes and encourages excellence in both of these mutually reinforcing areas. Now, there were and are other reasons for regulation, like creating a level playing field for different kinds of higher education provider, but I'll leave it there for now. So a regulator was brought in to protect the student interest in an increasingly large and important sector. And you can see this rationale reflected in our mission, which is to ensure that every student, whatever their background, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. You can also see it reflected in the 4 regulatory objectives on the slide here. So on the left, you've got participation, where we're striving for equality of opportunity. In the middle, you can see experience there, which is about what happens to students while they're in higher education. On the right, we have outcomes, and this is about what happens after university or college. Was it valuable to the students? What did it allow them to do in the rest of their lives? And then running along the bottom, you have value for money, which underpins and really is embodied by the other 3 objectives. Next slide, please. So that was why we regulate. And your next question might reasonably be, how does this regulation work? So we regulate English providers of higher education who have opted into our regulation. We have what's called a register, which lists all of the providers regulated by the Office for Students, and that currently sits at 423. Now, no institution is obliged to join our register. It's completely voluntary. But for those that do, OFS registration provides access to a variety of benefits that we've got listed on the screen. So access to university title, degree awarding powers, and the international student market through visa schemes. It also gives access to significant funding direct from taxpayers. So we've got things like the Strategic Priorities Grant funding, which used to be known as T-Grant funding. And to give you an indication of the scale, we distributed nearly £1.5 billion of this to more than 330 providers in this academic year. There are also other funding streams, and we allocated £276 million over the same period. And registration also allows access to the student finance system. So for students to access financial support, including tuition fee and maintenance loans and disabled students allowance. So those are the benefits. When a provider registers with us, they commit to meeting certain requirements. We call these conditions of registration. These are designed to ensure that universities and colleges are offering a high quality education. And a big part of our role is ensuring that these requirements are met in the interests of students. So to do this, we might intervene if we have evidence or concerns that a university or college isn't meeting one or more of its conditions of registration. And an intervention can range from something really quite light touch, it might be as small as just a conversation, through to much more serious interventions like sanctions such as monetary penalties. And as we use our tools, as we use these interventions, we do so in a risk-based way. By this, I mean our activity is prioritized and determined according to the risks posed to students and others. So the greater the risk posed, the more attention we pay and the more likely we are to act. Conversely, those that are low risk are least likely to hear from us. And to help us understand this risk, we use context, we use data, we use information from providers and from third parties to assess the risk of a university or a college breaching one of these conditions of registration. So just to recap that, our approach seeks to focus our regulatory attention on those providers most at risk of breaching our requirements and where there is most likely to be an impact on students. Next slide, please. So that was a whistle-stop tour of how our regulation works, and I'm going to pass to Philippa in a moment to talk through what it looks like in practice. But before I do, I'll say a few more words about our focus right now. So when we first launched, our focus was on building the register that I've just spoken about and registering all the existing providers that wanted to. We've since moved into a new phase, and our current strategy is underpinned by 2 key priorities: quality and standards and equality of opportunity. So first, and on kind of the left, or the top, I suppose, of the diagram on the slide, we have quality and standards. And this is about all students having a high quality academic experience that equips them for future work or further study. And this is really closely linked to the other area, equality of opportunity, which is about ensuring that all students, regardless of their background, can benefit from higher education. And these two things, quality and equality, go hand in hand. So you can't meaningfully have equality of opportunity if the quality of education is low. And similarly, raising quality and standards without improving equality of opportunity means the benefits are more narrow than they need to be, and there are students that could benefit but don't. So that's our focus for the current strategy. I'm now going to pass you on to Philippa, our Director of Regulation, to discuss what regulation means in practice.
Thanks, Josh. If we move to the next slide. Hello, everyone. It's really great to have so many of you join us today. I'm guessing that many of you will be new to the sector, and what a truly fantastic sector it is. I've joined the Office for Students and the higher education sector 6 months ago now, and I can truly say that I am still very much getting up to speed on all things higher education, and there is an awful lot to learn. I do have significant experience in regulation, having spent 20 years in the energy sector. But today I'm here to talk to you about what regulation looks like in practice. So Josh has covered why we do what we do, and I'm going to try and cover how we do it. What does our regulation mean to you, and how will we interact with you? So if we move to the next slide. Thank you. What does regulation look like in practice? Well, registering with the Office for Students brings access to benefits, and to stay registered, providers have to meet conditions of registration and demonstrate that they are offering high quality higher education. And those conditions of registration set the basis for our regulation. So if we start by talking about data requirements, one of the ways that we monitor compliance with our conditions of registration is through data requests, which enable us to ensure that providers are offering high quality education and understand more about individual providers' circumstances, and in aggregate more about the sector as a whole. And we publish 2 notices a year which request data. Institutions other than those who are also further education colleges or sixth form colleges are required to submit an annual financial return. This allows us to assess the financial viability and sustainability of universities and colleges, and to look at wider trends on financial resilience across the sector as a whole. And every July, we issue a notice outlining the other data returns that we'll be requesting from universities and colleges so they can plan. As well as being sent directly to institutions, these are publicly available on the deadlines page on our website, which I think a link to which will be being put into the chat now. For example, we collect data on the number of higher education students at a provider, data on students who have completed their studies, and information about the profile of providers. While data returns can be seen to be burdensome, they are critically important, not just for us, but for the students that we all serve, and for your institutions more broadly. In a risk-based regulatory model, timely and accurate provision of data is essential. This data really helps us to ensure that the sector is delivering in the interests of students, helps us to administer funding, generates information that helps students decide where they want to study, and also for us to monitor public fund spending. We're really keen to make sure that we are collecting that data as efficiently as possible, and that duplication in data requests are minimised. So if you do receive data requests that are particularly difficult or duplicative, and by that I mean between us and other bodies, then please do let us know. So if we move on to consultations, it's essential that we consult with the sector, including all of you, universities and colleges, students, and other interested parties on any changes that we're considering making to the regulatory framework. Consulting helps us to develop fair, evidence-based policies. It really builds our understanding of the work that's going on in the sector and the sector's view on things, and crucially really ensures that we can protect the interests of students. We value the opportunity to hear from all of you, but we also know that it takes time. And so we're really looking at what we can do to try and make it easier. We're looking at trying to stagger consultations where we can, use plain language, provide very clear exec summaries wherever possible, to try to ensure that our consultations are as accessible and effective as possible. And I want to also really stress that we do read and carefully consider every consultation response that we receive. We're always keen to hear your views. To hear more about consultations, you can sign up for email alerts on our work. Accountable officers also receive emails every 2 weeks, sharing any relevant publications and consultations. And also we try to make sure that we update on our work via our social media channels. At the moment, there are 2 open consultations, one on developing a new freedom of speech complaint scheme and one on regulating student unions in relation to freedom of speech. Anyone with an interest in freedom of speech can respond to these consultations, and we're particularly keen to hear from staff in the higher education sector, obviously from students and from student union representatives. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on and talk about quality, which is, as Josh said earlier, one of our key priorities, along with equality of opportunity. When it comes to quality, our aims are to ensure that all students from all backgrounds with the ability and desire to undertake higher education are supported to access, succeed in, and progress from higher education, that they should study on high quality courses and be able to progress to further study or to a successful career, and that those qualifications hold value over time. There are many examples of excellent teaching across the sector, and many of you here today will be directly involved in delivering that. But in order to protect the interests of students, we must consider regulatory action where standards fall below our baseline. And in 2022, we commissioned assessments into business and management courses and computing courses at a number of different providers, just to assure that the teaching at those providers was in line with our baseline. We'd really recommend that you read those reports, even if your university or college hasn't been assessed. They've got findings that will be, and information in there that will be really useful to you when you're considering your approach. We've published 6 assessment reports so far, and you can read those online. We also run the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is about providers hitting more than the baseline. So the TEF is encouraging providers to deliver excellence. This is essential because this is one of the areas, unsurprisingly, that students care the most about: teaching, learning, and positive outcomes from their courses. We've recently completed the TEF exercise in 2023, and you can read more about that on our website, and I think that's going to be linked in the chat. We also monitor specific conditions of registration that relate to quality. So we regulate the outcomes that students achieve against minimum thresholds, which are set below sector averages, so that we concentrate our engagement regarding quality improvements with universities and colleges who may be falling below our regulatory baseline. And we always consider the individual circumstances before making any judgments. As an example, the numerical threshold for completion of study for full-time first-degree students is 75%. So if a provider falls below that, we would need to consider the context in which they were operating. But it's possible that will indicate cause for concern. You can see more about our work on student outcomes and how your provider is performing in our student outcomes data dashboard. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on to equality of opportunity now. So we regulate equality of opportunity a little bit differently. Some of you may have heard or been involved in the creation of access and participation plans. These are developed by universities and colleges that charge the higher fee and set out how universities and colleges will improve equality of opportunity for underrepresented groups to access, succeed, and progress from higher education. So last year we published our Equality of Opportunity Risk Register, and this register identifies sector-wide risks that may affect a student's opportunity to access and succeed in higher education. This might be things like insufficient academic support, cost pressures, and capacity issues. Providers can use the register to consider the various risks that different groups of their students may face and the ways in which those risks may interact with each other. And from this, they can consider how they can contribute to reducing those risks in their access and participation plan. The access and participation plans are essential for students and a key part of our work. And using feedback from the sector, we've been developing our approach to try and make it as effective as it possibly can be. The Uni Connect programme is another way in which we support students. So this programme brings together 29 partnerships of universities, colleges and other local partners to offer activities, advice and information on the benefits and realities of going to university or college. It is a really excellent example of the sector working together in the interests of students, and more than 1.3 million young people from underrepresented groups have engaged with the programme so far, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. So beyond those two priority areas, as I've said before, providers need to meet our wider conditions of registration. And as you can imagine, there's a whole host of regulatory activity taking place behind the scenes at the Office for Students and at colleges and universities to ensure that remains the case. The broad areas our conditions cover are listed on the slide. So as well as access and participation and quality, you've got financial sustainability and the other things that are listed there. So just to kind of drill into that a bit further, Condition D requires that each provider demonstrates to the Office for Students that it remains financially viable and sustainable. We continuously review and analyse the latest data to understand the financial health of colleges and universities, and where we have concerns about financial difficulty at a particular provider, we would engage with that university or college to ensure that students are supported. Similarly, under Condition E, providers are required to have in place adequate and effective management and governance arrangements. So where we receive data or intelligence that indicates that might not be the case, we actively consider that and again engage with the university or college to ensure that students and taxpayers' interests are being protected. And more widely, when we have concerns about compliance with our conditions of registration, this can often lead us to consider whether or not universities or colleges have got the right management and governance arrangements in place to ensure that their university and college is being run appropriately. So next slide, please. So moving on to how we engage with universities and colleges. Well, in the last year, we've been strengthening our relationship with the providers we regulate and as the sector and with the sector as a whole. So based on feedback from the sector asking for more personal interactions, we've begun a programme of visits to universities and colleges across the country, ranging from specialist providers to further education colleges and large multi-faculty universities. We've visited more than 65 universities and colleges since June when the programme started, and I know it's been hugely valuable to us at the Office for Students. I hope it has been for the universities and colleges that we've visited as well. And personally, I've really valued the opportunity to see different universities and colleges up front and really understand what makes them different and what the similarities are, to hear about the challenges and opportunities that they are seeing, yeah, it's been really, really interesting and incredibly helpful for me as a new starter in this area. We've also increased our engagement with accountable officers. So our Chief Executive, Susan Lapworth, updates all accountable officers twice a month on important updates, Office for Students consultations, new regulatory guidance, upcoming events, and our wider work. Susan also holds quarterly briefings, which all accountable officers are invited to, where they can hear directly about current and upcoming priorities and learn more about particular topics. There are plenty of opportunities to keep up to date on what we are doing. You can sign up to one of our mailing lists to hear more about our work, or follow us on social media. Our handles are on the slide. But meanwhile, our day-to-day interaction with universities and colleges continues at pace. And this business as usual engagement is part and parcel of our work. So there are requirements on universities and colleges to notify us of certain events. We call them reportable events, things like a merger or a change of accountable officer or a new campus. We routinely engage with universities and colleges about those reportable events and about the data returns that they submit to us and any intelligence that we receive from other parties. In addition, universities and colleges sometimes require other activity from us, such as accessing applications submitted in pursuit of university title or degree awarding powers. These assessments also require regular ongoing engagement between OFS and the colleges and universities involved. So what you might not know is that all of this day-to-day activity is led by our core regulatory teams, and each provider has a named contact within one of those teams. So there's a specific person at the Office for Students that you can reach if you have questions or issues that you'd like to raise in relation to your institution. Next slide, please. How do we engage with students? Well, students are obviously the driving force behind our work. And so before we move on to the Q&A, I'd really like to highlight how they feed into what we do. Students are actively involved in our regulation. We have a student board member to represent the student experience, as well as a student panel made up of current undergraduate and postgraduate students and recent graduates. Our student panel advise our board and inform policy development across the organisation. They help us to understand student views and perspectives and challenge us to regulate in the interests of students. Students are also involved in specific policy areas, for example, in the TEF, where they were members of our TEF panel, which assessed the ratings of providers. Students at universities and colleges also made submissions about their views on the quality of their teaching, learning and outcome, which was all part of the decision making. We also run the National Student Survey, which is one of the largest census surveys of students about their experiences in the world. And we regularly poll students to inform policy development and support student unions to understand and engage with our processes. If students, staff, or members of the public feel that a university or college is not meeting our requirements, they can let us know by submitting a notification to let us know about an issue, which might not show up in other data or information we receive. It's worth sharing that we don't deal with individual disputes between students and universities and colleges. That's a common misconception. We ask students to use the complaint system in their university or college, and then the Office of Independent Adjudicator can review those complaints too. For the students in the room, I'd also like to share that we have a mailing list aimed specifically at students, our Student Spotlight. This mailing list shares regular updates about what we do and how you can get involved. This is an area of our work where we're constantly seeking to refine our approach in the interest of students. We're expanding our existing plan for a review of our approach to student engagement to consider more broadly the nature of students' experiences and their interest in higher education, and to identify where regulation can address the greatest risks to students. If you have feedback to share, please do contact the email address that's going to be put into the chat now, engagement@officeforstudents.org.uk. That was all I was going to say for now, and I'm going to hand back to Molly for the Q&A.
Thanks, Philippa. Next slide, please. So let's now move on to the Q&A portion of the event. And just a reminder, if you do want to submit a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. And we'll be getting through as many questions as possible today, but with more than 1,000 people here, we'll be also signposting you to the right places to get further answers. Okay, so first question we've got, Philippa, I think this is one for you. Are there any other regulatory bodies other than yourselves?
Sorry, my computer just completely died. So sorry about that, but it's thankfully recovered. There are some other regulatory bodies that can impact parts of the sector. So there's for kind of degree apprenticeships and things like that, Ofsted have a role. When it comes to further education colleges, for example, as I said earlier, we've got the ESFA, the Education Skills and Funding Agency, that oversee the financial resilience. So there is a relatively complex regulatory picture, but particularly for further education colleges.
Thanks, Philippa. A question for Josh. What percentage of higher education organisations register with you, with the OFS?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I don't actually know the answer. As I said, we've got 423 on our register, and then there is an unknown quantity beyond that. My suspicion is that the vast majority are registered with us, but there might be a long tail of very small higher education providers operating in England. But certainly, if you've heard of a higher education provider, almost certainly it's going to be on our register.
Thanks, Josh. Another question for Philippa. Can any provider registered with the OFS make a request for funding, and how do we find details of this?
So the funding, there's different funding for different types of activity, and there are details as to kind of what the arrangements are for that on the website, and we can provide more information on that.
And just to add to that, so some of our funding is done through formula. So it's not about requesting it, but there are kind of mechanisms which determine how much is allocated. But then sometimes we run funding competitions where people bid for a specific thing or theme or area. And I think it was posted in the chat earlier on, there's a way to sign up for our alerts. So I would encourage everyone, particularly if you've got responsibility for bidding for funding, to sign up to those, because then you'll be the first to know when we put out a new call.
Thanks both. Another question for Josh, perhaps. How big an organisation is the OFS in terms of headcount?
We are we're just shy of 400 headcount. It's a bit smaller in terms of FTE, and that's made up of people in Philippa's directorate, so regulators, kind of doing regulation, focusing on the quality and standards and the equality of opportunity, and that includes work on we have 2 directors appointed by the Secretary of State. We have John Blake, who works on equality of opportunity, the Director for Fair Access and Participation, and also Arif Ahmed, who's our Director for Academic Freedom and Free Speech, who works on matters related to free speech. And then you have support functions, which is people in my team and also back office functions.
Thanks, Josh. A question for Philippa. How does the Office for Students interrelate to the OIA, the Office for the Independent Adjudicator? Are you part of the same body, and do you share information?
So we are completely separate organisations. The Office for Independent Adjudication is set up completely separately. We do have and we don't share information routinely. We do have the ability to share information if we feel that is needed for each other's functions, and there are some cases where that happens. And obviously we do meet regularly. We have regular engagement with them so that we're identifying kind of themes that are kind of relevant to both of our areas of work, but that they are completely different governance, completely separate organisations, and the decision making is entirely independent.
Thanks. Another one for you. We've said the focus of the OFS is on where risk is the highest. How do you make this determination of risk? And is there some kind of publicly available risk matrix that the OFS uses to make this determination?
So I might hand over to Josh on that one, given the strategies.
Yes, sure. So probably the best, if you're looking for a thing to read and pore over, I'd recommend people look at Regulatory Advice 15. We'll post a link which sets out indicators that we look at. It's hard to give a narrow answer here because it does depend on the condition that we're looking at, and the context is really critical here. So it's not it's not an algorithm or a formula or a rigid framework that determines what the risk is. We have to look at the individual circumstance, the individual situation. Each provider is different, and we need to take that into account. So there's no hard and fast rule, but to give you some examples of things that we might look at. So rapid, unplanned growth in student numbers might give us cause for concern and might lead us to look more closely. We've been speaking about the OIA. So if the OIA got in touch with us and said, we're seeing a pattern of complaints at this provider or this cluster of providers, that would lead us to take a closer look. We also look at student data, continuation rates, progression rates, things like that. So it does depend on the condition of registration that we're looking at, and we're always really, it's critical that we take into account the context. But we'll post a link to some resources online which give even more examples than the ones I've just given.
Thanks. A question I think both of you could answer. Can you provide more detail about the provider visits? How are these arranged? What is the purpose and outcome? And how can individual institutions request a visit from the OFS?
Sure. Why don't I take this one? So the purpose of the visits, well, I guess there's two angles to it. The purpose for us is, I guess, ultimately to make us better regulators. It's really helpful for us to understand the context. I've mentioned context several times today. See what it's like on the ground, to hear about specific challenges from students, from staff and providers. So there's kind of a selfish reason for the OFS. And then the other side of it is for providers, for the visitees. So it's an opportunity for them to raise questions, to raise comments, raise concerns, suggestions, whatever else, and to show us whatever they want to show. It's an opportunity for them to have face time with their regulator. And today, I mean, we've only been doing this program for a relatively short period of time, but hearing lots of positive feedback from whenever I go out on visits, certainly, and that's what the team tells me too. The other part of the question was how can institutions arrange or request a visit themselves? So just get in touch with us. We'll share contact links for you. I won't talk in detail about the process for arranging which visits happen when. It's a very complicated administrative procedure. We have a list, we have a rota, and if you request a visit, we will get to you as we work through that list.
Thanks, Josh. We've got a question about quality. So it says, can you explain how you work with the QAA now the OFS has taken over activities that were delivered by them as the DQB?
Yeah, so the QAA, Philippa might want to come in here as well, but the QAA now no longer has a formal role in the regulatory system in England. So we don't work with them in that sense. They're not the DQB. They're not performing any quality functions in the English regulatory system. But we still engage with them. They're a major kind of constituent in the higher education space. So we talk to them about the trends that they're seeing and any intelligence that they're gathering. Is there anything you want to add to that, Philippa?
Yeah, I think it's probably just worth adding in terms of the quality assessments and the quality work that we now do ourselves that was done by QAA previously. We have independent experts from the higher education sector very much embedded and leading those assessments in most cases, which is really, really important in order to make sure that that work is being done effectively.
Thanks both. We've had two questions rolled into one here. Can you explain the named contact process? How can staff find out who their named contact is? And how do we know who our institution's accountable officers are?
So the name of the named contact is given to the accountable officers at the universities, and I think it's in it's repeated in different correspondence that goes out. In terms of knowing who your accountable officer are, that would probably be for your institutions to have processes in place to make sure that happens.
Yeah, the named contacts, your OFS named contacts, are at the bottom of every AO briefing that you receive. So there's a reminder every fortnight, or roughly every fortnight. And then typically the accountable officer is the senior most person in an institution. But yeah, it's something to ask your colleagues rather than us for your particular instance.
Thank you. Another question here. What's the role of the OFS in TNE and partnership arrangements with UK higher education providers? Do you regulate UK higher education and overseas TNE partnership arrangements? Lots of acronyms there.
Yeah, I'm happy to start this one off, and again, Philippa might want to add anything I forget. So, TNE, transnational education, for those who are not familiar, and the role of the OFS in transnational education. So we regulate if the education is being delivered by an English higher education provider that's on our register, that's in scope for our regulation. So we crudely we regulate TNE. So this is where an English provider has set up a campus overseas, for example. That's a classic example of TNE. So yes, we do regulate that space. It's slightly different because obviously there's other regulations, there's other rules, there's other dynamics going on when you're operating overseas, but it's within our locus. Something that has come up several times over the years and that I'm involved with at the moment is sometimes there are questions from overseas agencies, other nation states wanting to understand English regulation. And because there's been a change recently with the creation of the OFS, there's either some confusion or uncertainty. So if there are any providers on the call, or rather people in providers who work on TNE, and you're having concerns or there are difficulties with your TNE provision with other regulators overseas, please do get in touch with the OFS and we can help with that. So it depends on the case, of course, but as an example, we've written letters for providers that we regulate, which they can then use and share with overseas bodies. We're also very happy to have calls with overseas bodies to help smooth and reduce the regulatory burden that can occur when you're operating in different jurisdictions.
Thanks, Josh. Another question about our relationship with different bodies. So how do you work with HESA?
So again, HESA is a kind of important body in the chain, particularly in relation to data. So we work quite a lot with JISC, which is obviously kind of under HESA, in terms of the kind of data that they are producing, and we are a user of that. So we meet with them regularly. In fact, funnily enough, I met JISC this morning, just to kind of talk about any kind of issues that are coming up on data futures. Another part of the Office for Students is meeting very often with them and just making sure that that's being the issues are being resolved and that we're kind of making the progress we need to make. Josh, is there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, well, perhaps worth mentioning that JISC is our designated data body, so they have a statutory role in HERA, in the Higher Education and Research Act that I mentioned at the beginning. So they have duties to compile and make available various bits of information, and it's really important. So if we go back to the risk-based approach that we've described and the monitoring that Philippa was talking about, having good high-quality data streams is really important for us understanding the risk profile out there in the system. It's also important in terms of, I guess, regulatory burdens. So if we've got high-quality data coming through, that means we don't need to do as much fewer information requests of other forms, I suppose. It means that we can get a sense of what it's like for students at that institution without having to constantly visit, constantly ask for reports and so on and so forth. So it's a really important part of how we operate the system.
Thanks both. Another question, does the OFS regulate on issues such as mental health, specifically for students, or the cost of living crisis?
So our remit is to protect the interests of students. So if we obviously care very much about the student experience, and so the kind of I guess we're continuously looking as to what are the risks facing students, and how might we need to work with colleges and universities to tackle those risks, and that may be through a kind of direct condition of registration. There may be other kind of more informal routes that we can use. So mental health is an area that we're very aware of, with the kind of would absolutely expect institutions to be putting in place support for students, and that's kind of one of the big things. And actually that's where some of these provider visits have been really helpful, because you can kind of see at the first hand kind of what support is being put in to help students, and obviously they will impact those quality metrics that we see over time as well. So yes, what was the other one? It was mental health and cost of living. So again, we don't have any ability to impact what funding is available for students, either through the kind of loan system, or through the kind of through the loan system primarily, and the costs that students will face. So that's all government policy, not for the Office for Students. But again, that is a huge risk for students at the moment. So we are working closely with universities and colleges to find out what are they seeing, what risks are materialising for students, what support have they got in place to encourage, and it very much links in with our access and participation work as well.
And you can see both mental health and cost pressures are risks identified on the EOR, on the risk register that I was describing. So although we're not directly regulating those areas in kind of in a named or a badged way, the way that we regulate access and participation, and the way that we encourage providers to engage with these issues, these themes, along with others, are ones that we've specifically identified that providers should be thinking about when they're thinking about quality of opportunity.
Thanks both. Another question is
probably worth saying, actually, just on before we move on from the mental health, I have on the visits I've been at, I think I've seen some really, really good practice. So there is a lot that the sector is doing to support students, which is great to see.
Thank you. Is the OFS allowed to campaign on behalf of the higher education sector, and how do you engage with political stakeholders?
So I think campaign is an interesting word, and certainly not one that I'd use. I guess it depends what the question asker means, really. So we're not a campaigning body. We're a regulator. But one of the issues that kind of providers, the higher education sector campaigns on quite a lot is higher education finances. So our role is not to advocate for one policy mix over another, but it is really important that we are very candid about what we can see and the risks that we see emerging. So we're not campaigning, we're not advocating, but we are providing factual, targeted information to the system. So we publish an annual report on kind of, it's almost a state of the sector finances, typically in spring, and often Philippa and our chief exec Susan are talking about these issues throughout the year. And then we will also alert ministers and alert government to what we're seeing, the implications of current trends, financial headwinds, for example, on the sector finances. So we're not campaigning, but we are providing intel, information, analysis where it's appropriate.
Thank you. Are there a set of standard conditions that apply to all institutions with specific conditions then added on, or will each condition be unique to each institution?
So there are, it's probably easier for people to look at the regulatory framework document on the website, because that's actually really clear. But so that there are conditions, that there are a kind of set of conditions that, and depending on what the condition is, it either applies to everybody or it applies to certain categories of providers. So it may be that it applies to providers who are of a certain size or have got very, degree awarding powers or whatever it might be. And then there are specific conditions of registration that we can apply on providers if we see particular risks. And those risks may be identified as part of the registration process, or they may be identified as part of ongoing engagement and interaction with universities and colleges after that point. So yes, there are a mixture of standard and specific conditions, but even the standard ones don't all apply to everybody.
Thanks, Philippa. A question about quality. So with growing student numbers, how does the OFS ensure that the student experience continues to be of a high standard?
That's a great question. I think that there are a number of different tools that we use for this. So first of all, the outcome metrics that we use that I talked about earlier in terms of the attendance and progression and attainment give us a good idea if there's something not going quite right in a institution. We then have the ability to go in and investigate. We have a whole raft of reportable events and other intelligence that comes in that can give us a clue if there's something not right happening. And yeah, we use all of those to kind of get a picture and to be able to take action where that isn't happening. And like I said, by far, the majority of the sector is delivering really good quality, and the TEF process is there to recognise and reward that, and also to try and encourage people to raise the quality above the baseline and to reward institutions for doing that. But in terms of are people meeting our baselines or not, then that really is what the whole regulatory framework is there to try to do.
And perhaps worth adding here that growing student numbers can and usually is, vast majority of cases, a great thing. It means more people are able to experience the fantastic higher education system that we have. So that's a good thing. It's only where either because of the growing student numbers or because of other reasons, we're concerned that the quality and standards aren't quite up to scratch. That's what we're looking for. And I alluded to earlier rapid unplanned growth in student numbers. So that's not to kind of as a risk factor that we might look at or might be interested in. And that's where the risk or the hypothesis there is that if a course grows so much beyond the capacity, beyond its ability to expand, you might see quality and standards reduce, but you might not. It's just something that we want to look at further.
Thanks both. Following visits, does the OFS share best practice of work being undertaken to support students?
So the visits aren't quite the vehicle for that kind of thing. It's not quite kind of fact finding or gathering, and it's not quite the right vehicle for dissemination. In terms of best practice, I think the equality of opportunity area of our work is perhaps the most relevant here, and in particular the work that we've been doing recently on the importance of evaluation and evaluating the different tools, the different interventions that universities and colleges are using to mitigate risks, to improve equality of opportunity, and then and disseminating and sharing that. And TASO, for example, is a great vehicle for sharing that evaluation, for sharing those findings.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question in the interest of time. Can the OFS offer advisory support to providers who are looking for solutions to support student needs, for example, mental health support?
So we're really, really happy to talk to providers who are facing those kind of challenges and kind of talk through what it is that they're thinking of doing. We're not experts in terms of what providers should be doing, and therefore don't really provide advice, but we can absolutely talk about the kind of things that we're seeing, to kind of listen to the things that people are thinking of doing, and that kind of anything in terms of improving and helping providers to kind of improve, then yeah, we can't provide advice, but we're really happy to talk.
Thanks, Philippa. With that, I think that's the last question we're going to be able to cover today. So I'm going to pass back to you to close the session.
Great. Thank you very much, Molly. So I think there were more questions being asked than we've had time to answer today. So I wanted to share the best routes for getting your questions answered. You can send us an email. So that's at regulation@officeforstudents.org.uk. My screen has gone a bit strange, so I'm hoping you can all still hear me. Yeah, so the email is on these slides, and you can email these and we will get an answer to you. The team can point you in the right direction to information that's already out there if that's the case, or provide another answer. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope this was really helpful for you, and thank you very much for your really insightful and interesting questions. We are reaching the end of our time, so I'm going to close the webinar now. Thank you, everyone.